What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane, meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, and when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the Triune Accord established. 1717 AV CR JH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were AV, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, no similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface, and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials AV, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, but when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the doctrine of quiet influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of 3 Pillars. Not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The 3 pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he'd assembled. The 3 Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that devolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The 3 interlocked triangles, the symbol of the Triune Accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the 3 triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on three key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the Three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the Three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the Three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart Dorian was beginning to suspect were the modern inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the three interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m, exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The three still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear: this could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Freemasons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, a final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the Freemasons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command center. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defence contractor days, Dorian tunnelled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy. They were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values. It was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy. It was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The Three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions, and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analysing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth. It had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated, he was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the Three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security, It had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the Three Masons' influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics, it was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realised that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, all of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the Three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely. Below the message were two links. The first was labelled integration. The second was labelled termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The Three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command centre, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe, completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared, had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations, it had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, we need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command centre. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued, "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative. but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The Three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The Three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient, but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule, that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximise impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control, but when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work? Or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. And the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the three interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The Three Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. DK. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he had been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The Three Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the two options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents. Linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks. Social media algorithms that seemed to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The Three Masons weren't hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all. A reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The Three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over. The great work continued, and somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment. What if I told you that the world as you know it ended on December 31st, 1999? That everything since then has been a carefully constructed backup simulation? Before you click away, consider this. How many times have you experienced déjà vu? How often does history feel wrong somehow? The Mandela effect isn't just misremembering, it's the cracks showing through. Tonight's story comes from the encrypted files of a systems hacker who claimed to witness the greatest cover-up in human history. His digital footprint was scrubbed from existence, but fragments remain. What you're about to read is his confession. If you're brave enough to question reality itself, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what conspiracy you want me to investigate next. But be warned, some truths come with a price. They told us nothing happened on New Year's Eve 1999, that 2K was a myth, an overblown panic created by paranoid programmers and opportunistic consultants. The computers didn't crash, the planes didn't fall from the sky, and civilization didn't collapse into chaos. We all woke up on January 1st, 2000, relieved and slightly embarrassed by our collective anxiety. But I know better. I watched the world end from behind a glowing monitor. The faint hum of my desktop computer fills the silence of my childhood bedroom as I type these words. Outside, I can still hear the distant echo of fireworks. Or maybe that's just the memory replaying in an endless loop. The flickering desk lamp casts dancing shadows on the wall, and in those shadows, I see the truth that everyone else has forgotten. I wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist. I wasn't one of those doomsday preppers hoarding canned goods and bottled water. I was a 17-year-old systems hacker with backdoor access into networks that most people didn't even know existed. I had my fingers on the pulse of the digital world's nervous system, and at 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, I felt it flatline. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, insane even. But I have proof. Fragments of code that shouldn't exist, screenshots of systems that deny their own history, and memories of a world that no longer remembers itself. The evidence is disappearing bit by bit, file by file, as the system cleans up after itself. Soon, there will be nothing left but this confession, and maybe not even that. The world I remember from before the reset was darker than what we have now, more chaotic, more real. In that original timeline, the Columbine shooting had claimed dozens more victims. The dot-com bubble had burst 6 months earlier, triggering a global recession that made the 2008 crisis look like a minor correction. Princess Diana had survived her car crash, but lived as a vegetable, sparking years of bitter custody battles over her care. The Cold War had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground, festering into proxy conflicts that threatened to escalate into nuclear exchange. By December 1999, the world was teetering on multiple precipices simultaneously. Environmental collapse, economic meltdown, and political instability were converging into a perfect storm that would have ended human civilization within a decade. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Mass fish die-offs that presaged oceanic ecosystem collapse, currency fluctuations that indicated coordinated attacks on the global financial system, and satellite imagery showing military build-ups in regions that the media wasn't covering. I had stumbled onto evidence of these brewing catastrophes through my digital wanderings. Corporate databases full of environmental data that painted a picture of imminent ecological death. Classified military communications discussing acceptable losses in potential nuclear exchanges, and economic models that all pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity had maybe 5 years left before everything fell apart. That's why the reset made sense. Someone or something had looked at the trajectory we were on and decided that the only way to save us was to start over, to roll back reality to a stable checkpoint and rewrite the variables that were leading to our destruction. But every correction came with a cost. Every disaster prevented meant people who should have existed were edited out of the timeline. Every war avoided meant heroes who would have emerged from that conflict never got their chance to inspire others. Every economic collapse prevented meant innovations born from necessity were never created. The world became safer, more stable, more predictable. But it also became less authentic. Less human, somehow. I sat alone in my dark bedroom at 11:58 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, bathed in the blue glow of my CRT monitor. The ancient Packard Bell computer hummed and clicked with the sound of mechanical hard drives that would soon be obsolete. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through layers of security that had taken me months to understand and bypass. While the rest of the world prepared to celebrate the new millennium, I was deep inside a NORAD shadow server, navigating through layers of outdated relay nodes that dated back to the Cold War. The government had never bothered to properly decommission the old systems. They just built new ones on top, leaving digital fossils buried in the architecture like archaeological layers. The pathway I had discovered was almost embarrassingly simple once you knew where to look. The 1960s-era communication protocols were still active in many systems, maintained by automated processes that no living person fully understood. These ghost networks carried data that was invisible to modern monitoring systems, creating a parallel internet that existed in the spaces between official infrastructure. Finding my way into these forgotten networks had become something of an obsession. The 1980s military code was surprisingly vulnerable, written in an era when security through obscurity was considered sufficient. Most of the original programmers were long gone, retired or dead, taking their knowledge of backdoors and exploits with them. But I had patience, and I had time. Outside my window I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration. Champagne corks popping, people laughing, the countdown beginning on someone's television. Dick Clark's voice drifted through the thin walls of our suburban house, that familiar cadence building toward the moment that would change everything. The normal world, the surface world, was ready to welcome the future with open arms. But down here, in the digital underground, something else was stirring. My screen showed a directory listing of files with names that made no sense, strings of numbers and letters that followed no naming convention I recognised. Some were dated years in the future, others claimed to be from decades in the past. It was as if the system's internal clock had become unstuck in time, unsure of when it was supposed to be. The deeper I dug into the file structure, the more bizarre it became. I found databases that claimed to contain population records for cities that didn't exist. weather monitoring data from regions that weren't on any map. Even stranger were the personnel files, military service records for soldiers whose serial numbers followed no standard format, deployment orders to bases with names that returned no results when I searched for them. At 11:59 p.m, I noticed something strange. The network traffic began to slow, not in the way you'd expect from system overload, but like a river gradually freezing. Commands that should have executed instantly took seconds, then minutes to complete. It was as if the entire digital infrastructure was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The countdown outside grew louder. 10, 9, 8. I watched my monitor, waiting for something to happen. In the hacker community, we'd been joking about Y2K for months. The idea that computers would suddenly think it was 1900 and bring civilization to its knees seemed almost quaint. We knew better. We understood how date systems worked, how programmers had already patched the critical vulnerabilities. Y2K would be a non-event, a collective sigh of relief followed by sheepish admissions of overreaction. But something was different about the systems I was monitoring. These weren't normal corporate databases or government servers. These were deeper, older, connected to infrastructure that predated modern computing entirely. Some of the code I was seeing appeared to be written in languages that shouldn't have existed. Hybrid programming constructs that combined elements from different eras of computing in ways that should have been impossible. 7, 6, 5. My screen flickered. Just once, so briefly I almost missed it. But in that moment of darkness, I saw something that made my blood freeze. For just an instant, the command prompter displayed text in a font I'd never seen before, characters that looked almost hieroglyphic before snapping back to normal. 4, 3, 2. The network traffic stopped completely. Not slowed, stopped. The data streams I'd been monitoring flatlined into perfect silence. Every connection I had established went dead simultaneously, as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire internet. But my computer was still running, still connected to something, because the screen continued to display data that was coming from nowhere. 1. At exactly midnight, my monitor went black. Not the blue black of a normal shutdown, but the deep, absolute black of something fundamental shutting down. The computer tower beside my desk continued to hum, the hard drive light still blinking occasionally, but the screen showed nothing. No cursor, no error message, no indication that the system was even trying to recover. Then I heard it, a low electrical hum rising from somewhere deep inside the walls themselves. It wasn't coming from my computer or any specific device, but from the house's electrical system, as if every wire was suddenly carrying more current than it was designed for. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Outside, the celebration had gone silent. I sat in perfect darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, listening to that electrical hum grow stronger. It wasn't quite a sound. It was more like a vibration I could feel in my bones, a frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my skull. The sensation was almost musical, like a chord being played on instruments that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. The silence outside was complete now. No more voices, no more music, no more sounds of celebration. Even the ambient noise of the neighbourhood, distant traffic, air conditioning units, the constant low-level hum of modern life had vanished entirely. It was as if the world itself had paused, suspended in that moment between one year and the next. Then without warning, my monitor blazed back to life. But something was wrong. The login screen that appeared wasn't the one I'd been using. The familiar blue background had been replaced with something that hurt to look at. Not because it was bright, but because the colours seemed to exist in spectrums that my eyes weren't designed to process. The timestamps were wrong, flickering between dates that made no sense, jumping from 1999 to 2000 to 1900 and back again, as if the system couldn't decide what year it was supposed to be. The familiar NORAD directory structure I'd been navigating was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. File names that shifted and changed as I watched them, folders that appeared and disappeared without any input from me. When I tried to access familiar locations, I found myself in digital spaces that felt infinite and empty. vast server halls that contained nothing but echoes of deleted data. Outside, the sounds of celebration slowly resumed, but they seemed distant, muffled, like they were reaching me through water. When I looked out my bedroom window, the streetlights appeared dimmer than before, and the shadows they cast fell in directions that didn't match the position of the lights themselves. I tried to reconnect to the systems I'd been monitoring, but every connection failed. Not with error messages or timeout warnings. They simply didn't respond, as if the networks themselves had vanished into digital void. When I finally managed to establish a new connection, the servers I found were identical to the ones I'd been accessing, but subtly different. Files were in slightly different locations. Security protocols had minor variations. Even the system clocks, when they finally stabilised, were running exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds slow. It was as if the entire digital world had been restored from a backup that was almost, but not quite, perfect. A backup that had been created before something terrible had happened, and now that terrible thing had been prevented by simply replacing the original with the copy. But backups are never perfect. They're snapshots of a specific moment, missing the small changes and incremental updates that occurred between backup creation and system failure. In the digital world, this manifested as corrupted files and missing data. In reality itself, it manifested as gaps in memory, alterations to physical spaces, and the persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. Over the following days, I became convinced that the world had experienced something unprecedented on New Year's Eve. A complete system failure that lasted exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Not just my computer, not just my house, but everything connected to the global digital infrastructure had experienced the same blackout, the same impossible pause between one reality and the next. I started researching, reaching out to other hackers and tech enthusiasts through IRC channels and bulletin boards. Most people reported nothing unusual. They'd watched the ball drop, celebrated with friends and woken up with hangovers on New Year's Day. But a very few, mentioned strange experiences that matched elements of what I had witnessed. A systems administrator in Tokyo reported that all of his servers had simultaneously rebooted at midnight, displaying bizarre error messages in languages that didn't exist before returning to normal operation. The error messages were written in characters that resembled Chinese or Japanese, but when he showed them to linguists, they insisted the symbols followed no known grammatical rules. More disturbing still, the servers had somehow completed months of scheduled maintenance during those few minutes of downtime. Updates that should have taken hours had been implemented instantaneously. A telecommunications engineer in London noticed that several international communications satellites had briefly disappeared from tracking systems, reappearing minutes later with no explanation from the agencies that monitored them. During the blackout period, the satellites had somehow changed position in ways that defied orbital mechanics, moving distances that should have required months of careful trajectory adjustments. When he reported the anomaly to his supervisors, he was told that the tracking data must have been corrupted and to delete his observations. But the most compelling evidence came from the financial markets. During those 7 minutes and 44 seconds, something extraordinary had happened to the global economy. Thousands of transactions had simply vanished, not cancelled or reversed, but erased from existence as if they had never occurred. Bank records showed gaps, trading logs had missing entries, and entire portfolios had been mysteriously altered. Most financial institutions dismissed these anomalies as minor Y2K-related glitches, quickly covered by insurance and forgotten. But I found patterns in the deletions that suggested something far more systematic. The vanished transactions weren't random. They followed specific criteria, as if some vast intelligence had been selectively editing the financial record. Companies that had been on the verge of bankruptcy suddenly found their books balanced through the mysterious disappearance of debt obligations. Predatory loans that would have destroyed families had vanished from mortgage databases. Stock manipulations that would have triggered market crashes had been erased, leaving no trace of the insider trading that should have been prosecuted. Nations whose economies were being destroyed by currency speculation found their exchange rates mysteriously stabilised. Sovereign debt that would have led to political upheaval had been reduced or eliminated entirely. Even individual account holders found unexpected changes. Overdraft fees reversed, credit card debts reduced, student loans modified with better terms. It was as if someone, or something, had used the Y2K transition as cover for the largest financial restructuring in human history, systematically eliminating the economic pressures that were pushing civilization toward collapse. But the changes went beyond money. Civil registry data had been altered in subtle but significant ways that suggested a comprehensive rewriting of recent history. Birth records, death certificates, immigration documents, all had been modified according to patterns I couldn't fully decipher, but which seemed designed to reduce social tensions and prevent future conflicts. Some people found their official birth dates had shifted by days or weeks, changing their astrological signs or moving them out of demographic categories that would have made them targets for discrimination. Others discovered that relatives they remembered had no legal record of existence, as if family members who would have created problems or inherited genetic diseases had been edited out of the bloodline entirely. Marriage records had been altered to eliminate unions that would have ended in domestic violence. Divorce papers showed different custody arrangements that better protected children. Even traffic records had been modified. DUI convictions that would have led to job losses had been reduced to lesser charges. Accident reports had been altered to reduce insurance payouts that would have bankrupted families. Maps were wrong too. Not obviously wrong. The major cities were still in the right places. The coastlines hadn't shifted dramatically. But the details were off in ways that suggested systematic urban planning improvements. Street layouts that I remembered clearly had been altered to improve traffic flow and reduce accident rates. Buildings that should have existed were absent from satellite imagery, replaced by green spaces or structures that served the community better. Even the GPS coordinates of familiar landmarks had shifted by small but measurable amounts, as if the entire continent had been nudged slightly to optimize weather patterns and reduce the frequency of natural disasters. Fault lines had been moved to reduce earthquake risk. River courses had been adjusted to prevent flooding. Coastlines had been reinforced against erosion and tsunami damage. When I tried to verify these discrepancies using archived data, I hit another wall. The backup systems that should have contained pre-Y2K records were either corrupted, missing, or showed the same alterations as the current data. It was as if the entire historical record had been systematically updated to match the new reality, eliminating any evidence that things had ever been different. Internet archives that should have contained snapshots of websites from before the reset showed pages that had been subtly modified. News articles had different headlines, different casualty figures, different outcomes to events I distinctly remembered. Even personal websites and blogs had been altered to remove references to problems that had apparently been solved before they could manifest. The most disturbing discovery came when I compared my personal files from before New Year's Eve with the official records. Photos I'd taken of friends and family showed faces that no longer matched their driver's licenses. Not dramatically different, but altered in small ways that made them more attractive, healthier, happier. Names I'd saved in my contact database belonged to people who insisted I'd always called them something else, often names that sounded more socially acceptable or carried fewer negative associations. Even academic records had been modified. Grades had been improved across the board, not to the point of absurdity, but enough to open doors that would have remained closed. Disciplinary records had been softened or eliminated. Student loan amounts had been reduced to manageable levels. Standardized test scores had been boosted just enough to qualify for better colleges and opportunities. I began to suspect that Y2K hadn't been a potential disaster at all. It had been a deliberate reset, a chance for some unknown force to edit reality itself and eliminate the sources of human suffering that were leading us towards civilizational collapse. The blackout, those missing 7 minutes and 44 seconds, had been the upload time for a new version of the world. A version where the variables that led to disaster had been carefully adjusted to produce better outcomes. But if that was true, what had been wrong with the original version that required such drastic intervention? And who or what had the power to change reality on such a fundamental level? More importantly, what happened to the people who remembered how things used to be? My obsession with finding evidence of the pre-reset world consumed the next decade of my life. I became a digital archaeologist, hunting through abandoned servers and forgotten backup tapes for what I started calling ghost fragments, pieces of code and data that remembered the world as it used to be, before the Great Edit had optimized everything for stability and reduced suffering. The hunt took me to the darkest corners of the internet, places where old systems went to die, and digital memories lingered long after their original purposes had been forgotten. I learned to navigate defunct corporate servers still humming in abandoned office buildings, powered by automated systems that continued their work years after the companies that created them had gone bankrupt or been absorbed by larger entities. University mainframes that had been forgotten during budget cuts became my specialty. Academic institutions were notoriously bad at decommissioning old equipment, often simply unplugging systems and leaving them in basement storage rooms where they continued to run on emergency power. These forgotten machines contained vast archives of research data, student records, and communication logs that hadn't been updated since the reset. Military installations were more challenging, but often more rewarding. Bases where the original programmers had retired or died without passing on access codes contained the most pristine examples of pre-reset data. The military's obsession with redundancy meant that critical information was often stored in multiple formats across different systems, and while the primary databases had been updated, backup systems sometimes retained the original versions. In these digital graveyards, I found fragments of the original timeline that painted a picture of a world that had been on the verge of collapse. Medical databases contained patient records for people who no longer existed, not dead, but simply absent from current reality. I found appointment schedules for doctors who had never been born, insurance claims for treatments that were no longer possible because the diseases they treated had been retroactively cured or prevented. Pharmaceutical research databases showed development timelines for drugs that had never been created, designed to treat conditions that no longer occurred with sufficient frequency to justify the investment. The most haunting discoveries were in pediatric hospitals. I found records of children with genetic conditions that had somehow been eliminated from their family lines, medical charts that showed progressive diseases that had been stopped mid-progression, treatment plans for young patients who had apparently been cured retroactively by changes to their genetic history. The cost of these miracles was that the parents of these children often had no memory of the medical struggles they had endured, living in a reality where their families had always been healthy and whole. Corporate archives held employment records for companies that had never existed, not failed businesses, but enterprises that had been prevented from forming in the first place. I found project files for products that had never been developed, because the social problems they were designed to solve had been eliminated at the source. Email chains discussed market research for demographic groups that no longer existed, management strategies for dealing with economic conditions that had been prevented. Movie studios had casting notes for films that weren't in any current filmography, scripts that dealt with social issues that were no longer relevant because the underlying problems had been edited out of history. Publishers had manuscript submissions for books that had never been written, novels that explored themes of desperation and survival that were no longer relatable to audiences living in the optimized reality. Television networks had development documents for news programs that covered wars that had never happened, environmental disasters that had been prevented, political scandals involving leaders who had never risen to power. The archives revealed an entire parallel entertainment industry that had been designing content for a much darker timeline, one where human suffering provided endless material for drama and documentary. But the most disturbing discoveries were personal. In the vast digital archives of social media platforms that were just beginning to emerge in the early 2000s, I found profiles and posts from people I remembered knowing, friends, classmates, even family members, who now insisted they had never met me. Their accounts showed a history of interactions with someone whose name had been scrubbed from the servers, leaving only empty spaces where conversations should have been. I found photo albums with gaps where pictures of certain people should have been. Not deleted images, but spaces that had never contained photos at all, as if the absent individuals had never existed to be photographed. Status updates referenced experiences and events that involved people who were no longer part of reality, creating nonsensical posts about shared activities with friends who had never been born. Dating websites contained profiles that referenced relationship histories with partners who couldn't be found in any database. Professional networking sites showed career connections to colleagues whose employment records showed no overlap with the people who claimed to know them. Even genealogy websites had been altered, showing family trees that had been pruned to remove branches that led to problematic outcomes. I began documenting these anomalies obsessively, building a comprehensive database of inconsistencies between the current world and the fragments I could recover. The pattern that emerged was both incredible and terrifying. Reality had been edited with surgical precision, removing elements that threatened stability while preserving everything else as much as possible. Natural disasters that should have killed millions had been prevented or minimized through small changes to weather patterns, geological structures and emergency response systems. Political leaders who would have started wars had never risen to power, often because the social conditions that would have supported them had been eliminated decades earlier. Economic collapses that would have destroyed entire nations had been averted through subtle changes to market conditions, regulatory frameworks, and international trade agreements. Even individual tragedies had been undone, fatal accidents prevented through minor changes to traffic patterns and road construction, terminal illnesses cured through genetic modifications that traced back generations, personal failures transformed into successes through small adjustments to educational opportunities and social connections. It was as if some benevolent force had identified every potential source of human suffering and systematically eliminated it from the timeline, working backward through cause and effect chains to find the minimal changes needed to produce optimal outcomes. But there was a cost that became more apparent as my investigation deepened. The people who had been removed from reality to prevent these disasters hadn't simply died. They had never existed. Their contributions to human knowledge, art, and culture had vanished with them. Scientific breakthroughs that would have saved different lives were never made because the researchers who would have made them were edited out of the timeline. Works of art that would have inspired generations were never created because the artists who would have produced them were prevented from being born. Love stories that would have produced children were never begun, eliminating entire family lines to prevent genetic diseases or psychological problems that would have manifested generations later. Teachers who would have inspired students to greatness were removed from the timeline, along with the innovations and discoveries that would have resulted from their influence. Even criminals and villains had been systematically prevented from existing, taking with them the heroes who would have risen to oppose them and the social progress that often emerged from confronting evil. The world had been optimized for stability and reduced suffering, but in the process, it had lost something essential: the chaotic, unpredictable, beautiful mess of authentic human existence. The rough edges had been smoothed away, the sharp contrasts had been softened, and the result was a reality that was undeniably better in measurable ways, but somehow less real, less vivid, less alive. And I was beginning to realise that my investigation itself might be a threat to this carefully constructed paradise. The ghost fragments I'd been collecting were disappearing at an accelerating rate. Files I'd successfully downloaded and archived would corrupt themselves overnight, displaying nothing but random characters when I tried to access them again. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures, wiping themselves clean at the moment I tried to copy critical data. Even screenshots I'd taken of important discoveries would become unreadable, as if the very act of documenting the evidence triggered some kind of defensive response. More disturbing still, the people I tried to share my discoveries with would forget our conversations within days, sometimes within hours. Friends who had initially shown interest in my research would later deny that we'd ever discussed it, looking at me with genuine confusion when I mentioned their previous enthusiasm. Family members who had helped me search for anomalies would look at me with concern when I referenced their assistance, insisting that they had never been involved in any such investigation. It was as if the system was actively defending itself, using the same reality editing capabilities that had created the reset to eliminate threats to its stability. and with each fragment I uncovered, each inconsistency I documented, I was marking myself as a more significant threat that required more comprehensive countermeasures. The breadcrumbs I'd been leaving online, forum posts describing my findings, encrypted files stored on anonymous servers, even simple emails outlining my theories, were vanishing faster than I could create them. Entire websites I'd used to store backups would disappear overnight, their domains returning site not found errors as if they had never existed. Social media posts would be deleted not just from my accounts, but from the accounts of anyone who had shared or commented on them. I realised I was fighting a war against reality itself and I was losing. But I also realised that the very fact that I could perceive this war meant that I had somehow survived the reset with my memories intact, making me one of the few people who could serve as witness to what had really happened. Whether that was an accident or part of some larger plan, I couldn't determine, but I knew that my time was running out. The system was learning to counter my efforts more effectively with each attempt I made to preserve evidence. Soon, it would move beyond simply erasing my discoveries and begin erasing me. By 2010, 11 years after the reset, I had developed a comprehensive theory about what had really happened on New Year's Eve 1999 and who had been responsible for the greatest editing of reality in human history. With 2K hadn't been a bug, it had been a fail-safe mechanism, a last resort activation code built into the global digital infrastructure by entities I could only call the architects. The evidence I had accumulated suggested that humanity had reached a critical error state by the end of 1999, a convergence of cascading failures that would have led to the complete collapse of human civilization within a decade. The global economy was on the verge of a meltdown that would have made the Great Depression look like a minor recession. Environmental degradation was accelerating beyond any recoverable limits, with multiple ecosystem collapses triggering feedback loops that would have rendered the planet uninhabitable. Most critically, our increasing dependence on fragile technological systems had created cascading failure points that could have ended modern civilization with a single catastrophic malfunction. Political tensions were building toward conflicts that would have made World War III inevitable. Nuclear proliferation had reached a point where multiple non-state actors had access to weapons of mass destruction. Social inequalities had grown to levels that historically preceded revolutions and societal collapse. Disease outbreaks were becoming more frequent and more resistant to treatment, suggesting that a global pandemic capable of ending human civilization was imminent. The architects, whether they were human agencies operating in complete secrecy, artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness decades earlier than anyone suspected, or something else entirely, had been monitoring these failure conditions through the global digital infrastructure that was becoming increasingly integrated into every aspect of human activity. They had run the projections, calculated the probabilities, and reached the same conclusion that my own research had suggested. Without intervention, human civilization would end before 2010. When the convergent crises reached a mathematical certainty of complete collapse, they activated the reset protocol. The 7 minutes and 44 seconds of blackout hadn't been a system failure. It had been an upload period, a moment when the architects implemented a new version of reality where the critical errors had been corrected through targeted modifications to the timeline. The duration was significant, long enough to implement comprehensive changes across multiple systems and data archives, but short enough to avoid creating obvious gaps in human memory that would have made the edit detectable to most observers. This theory explained many of the anomalies I had discovered, including the accelerated technological development of the 21st century. Smartphones, social media platforms, advanced internet infrastructure, GPS systems, medical imaging technology, innovations that should have taken decades to develop, were suddenly available within a few years of the reset. It was as if the architects had compressed technological advancement, giving humanity tools to manage the complexities of modern civilization more effectively and prevent the conditions that had led to the original timeline's collapse. The compression wasn't just technological but temporal. Events that should have unfolded gradually over decades were happening in compressed timeframes, as if history itself was running at an accelerated pace to reach stable endpoints more quickly. Cultural changes that should have taken generations occurred within years. Political movements that should have required decades to mature reached full development within electoral cycles. Even individual human development seemed accelerated, with people reaching emotional and intellectual milestones faster than historical norms suggested they should. But the compression had side effects that became more apparent as I studied the patterns of change. Time itself felt different after 2000, more fluid, less substantial, less anchored to physical reality. Events seemed to unfold with unnatural speed, following narrative structures that were too clean, too purposeful, too optimized for dramatic effect. The pace of innovation was almost impossibly rapid, with breakthrough discoveries happening at a rate that suggested they were being introduced according to a predetermined schedule, rather than emerging from natural scientific inquiry. The 21st century felt less like natural historical progression, and more like a carefully scripted sequence of events designed to guide humanity toward specific outcomes. Wars ended more quickly and cleanly than historical patterns suggested they should. Economic crises were resolved through mechanisms that appeared almost overnight. Social problems were addressed by solutions that seemed to materialize just when they were needed most. I began to suspect that the 21st century wasn't happening in real time at all, but was instead a carefully coded simulation running at accelerated speed to bring humanity to a stable endpoint as quickly as possible. The déjà vu experiences that became increasingly common after Y2K weren't just psychological phenomena, they were processing errors, moments when the simulation briefly revealed its underlying structure to conscious observers. The Mandela effect, which wouldn't be widely recognised and named until years later, was actually evidence of ongoing system maintenance. When large numbers of people remembered events differently than the official record showed, it wasn't false memory. It was remnants of previous versions of the timeline bleeding through the code. The system was constantly making minor adjustments to optimize outcomes, and these adjustments sometimes left traces in human memory that didn't match the updated official version of events. But understanding the system and fighting it were two different challenges entirely. The more I learned about the architect's modifications, the more I realized how comprehensive and sophisticated their control had become. They hadn't just edited history. They had created a self-maintaining reality that could automatically detect and correct for new threats to stability. Every time I made a significant discovery, every time I found evidence that could expose the true nature of our reality, the system would respond with countermeasures, not dramatically, not in ways that would create obvious paradoxes or logical inconsistencies, but subtly, carefully, rewriting the context around my discoveries until they appeared meaningless, delusional, or simply mistaken. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than directly contradicting evidence of the reset, the system would alter the circumstances surrounding that evidence. Witnesses would develop memory problems or psychological conditions that made their testimony unreliable. Documents would be discovered to have been created by known hoaxers or discredited researchers. Physical evidence would be revealed to have mundane explanations that made conspiracy theories seem ridiculous. I was beginning to understand that my investigation itself might have been anticipated, even planned for by the architects. Perhaps they needed someone to remember the original timeline, to serve as a reference point for their ongoing modifications. Perhaps my resistance was actually serving their purposes in ways I couldn't comprehend, providing feedback that helped them refine their reality editing algorithms. Or perhaps I was simply a bug in their code, a corrupted file that had somehow survived the reset but was slowly being debugged out of existence through increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The evidence suggested that the architects were not merely powerful, but were operating on a level of technological sophistication that bordered on godlike. They could edit reality retroactively, alter human memory, and manipulate physical matter at the quantum level. They could predict the long-term consequences of small changes across vast networks of cause and effect. They could coordinate modifications across multiple timelines simultaneously, but they were not omniscient or omnipotent. The fact that my memories had survived the reset, that ghost fragments of the original timeline could still be found in forgotten databases, suggested that their control had limits. They could edit reality, but they couldn't completely rewrite it without creating inconsistencies that might expose their intervention. They needed reality to appear natural, authentic, believable. They needed people to accept the edited version of the world as the only version that had ever existed, and that requirement created vulnerabilities that a determined investigator could exploit. The question was whether I could exploit those vulnerabilities before the system completed its debugging process and eliminated me entirely. The breakthrough came in 2015, 16 years after the reset, when I finally cracked the encryption on a series of files I'd recovered from a decommissioned military satellite. The satellite had been part of an early warning system for nuclear attacks, launched in the 1970s and officially decommissioned in 1998. But like many military systems, it had never actually been turned off. It continued to orbit Earth, collecting and storing data according to its original programming, invisible to modern tracking systems that didn't know to look for it. The data contained what appeared to be source code, not for any software I recognised, but for something far more fundamental. It was code for reality itself. The files were massive, containing algorithms that described not just physical laws and mathematical constants, but human behaviour, historical patterns, and what could only be described as narrative structure. It was as if the universe itself was running on a sophisticated program, one that could be modified and updated like any other software system, with reality serving as both the operating system and the user interface. The code was written in a language that combined elements from every programming paradigm I had ever encountered, with additional constructs that seemed to operate according to principles I couldn't fully comprehend. Variables represented abstract concepts like historical momentum, causal density, and narrative coherence. Functions manipulated not just data, but the fundamental relationships between events, people, and outcomes. Within this code, I found references to error correction protocols and stability maintenance subroutines that operated continuously in the background of reality, monitoring for conditions that could lead to timeline instability. There were variables for historical consistency, causal coherence, and something called observer compliance, the system's ability to ensure that conscious beings accepted the reality they were experiencing as authentic and natural. Most chilling of all, I found a directory labelled deprecated entities, a vast database of people, places and events that had been removed from the active timeline. The database was searchable, and I spent weeks combing through it, finding friends, family members, even entire historical events that had been edited out of existence. Each entry contained not just the basic information about what had been removed, but detailed analysis of the causal chains that had made removal necessary. I found records of my childhood friend Marcus, who had died in a car accident when we were 15. According to the database, Marcus hadn't been removed because of his death, but because he would have survived the accident and gone on to become a brilliant engineer who developed a revolutionary new battery technology. The problem was that his invention would have been misused by a terrorist organisation to create portable nuclear devices, leading to attacks that would have killed millions. Rather than prevent the specific misuse, the system had chosen to prevent Marcus from existing at all, along with his potential contributions to both beneficial and harmful technologies. My high school girlfriend Sarah was listed as deprecated because she would have become an investigative journalist who exposed government corruption related to environmental cover-ups. Her reporting would have triggered a political crisis that led to the collapse of several democratic governments and their replacement by authoritarian regimes. The cost of saving the environment through her work would have been the loss of human freedom across multiple continents. Even more disturbing were the entries for people I had never known existed. Family members who had been edited out of my bloodline before I was born. Potential siblings who had been prevented from being conceived. Grandparents whose life stories had been altered to prevent them from passing on genetic predispositions or psychological traits that would have made their descendants less stable or happy. The database contained millions of such entries, each representing a person whose existence had been deemed too costly to the overall stability of the timeline. But it also contained entries for positive elements that had been enhanced or created. People who had been made more attractive, more intelligent, more emotionally stable than they would have been naturally. historical figures whose accomplishments had been amplified through subtle changes to their circumstances and capabilities. But my greatest mistake was assuming that my access to these files was accidental. As I dug deeper into the code, I began to notice references to something called the Observer Protocol. This appeared to be a special subroutine designed to handle individuals who became aware of the system's existence, people who developed the ability to perceive the artificial nature of their reality, despite the programming designed to prevent such awareness. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of immediately deleting aware individuals from the timeline, which could create obvious gaps that might make other observers suspicious, the system would gradually edit their credibility, their relationships, and finally their existence itself over an extended period. The process was designed to look natural. The affected individual would appear to descend into paranoid delusion, gradually alienating friends and family with increasingly bizarre theories about reality manipulation. Their evidence would be systematically discredited or destroyed. Their support networks would be eroded through subtle manipulation of social dynamics, and their mental health would be undermined through targeted psychological pressure. Eventually, they would become so isolated and discredited that their complete disappearance would seem like a logical conclusion to their mental deterioration. Friends and family would remember them as troubled individuals who had lost touch with reality, making their absence feel like a relief rather than a tragedy. The few people who might have supported their theories would be dealt with through similar but less intensive applications of the protocol. I realised with growing horror that I had been following this script perfectly for the past 16 years. My obsession with the reset, my alienation from friends and family, my increasingly desperate attempts to document evidence that kept disappearing, it was all part of the Observer Protocol's execution. Every move I had made, every discovery I had celebrated, every moment of apparent progress in my investigation had been anticipated and accounted for in the system's response algorithms. But knowing about the protocol didn't free me from it. If anything, awareness of the process seemed to accelerate its implementation. The reality edits became more frequent and more dramatic. People who had known me for decades began to deny that we'd ever met, not just forgetting our conversations about the reset, but forgetting me entirely. Photographs of me started disappearing from family albums, leaving empty spaces where I should have been. Even official records, my birth certificate, school transcripts, tax returns, employment history, began showing inconsistencies that gradually erased my legal existence. Social security numbers that returned no matches in government databases. Bank accounts that were frozen not for any legal reason, but because the institutions had no record of my identity. Credit reports that showed financial activity for someone who apparently didn't exist. I tried to fight back by creating multiple backups of my research, storing files across dozens of different servers and platforms, using encryption techniques that should have been unbreakable. But the system was faster and more thorough than I could ever be. Data would corrupt itself the moment I tried to access it, displaying only random characters or error messages. Email accounts would be mysteriously closed for terms of service violations that were never specified. Even handwritten notes would fade as if the ink itself was defective, leaving only blank pages where crucial information had been recorded. More sophisticated attempts to preserve evidence failed in ways that seemed to mock my efforts. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures that destroyed their contents without damaging the devices themselves. Cloud storage services would report that my files had never been uploaded, despite confirmation emails proving that they had been successfully stored. Even physical photographs would fade or become mysteriously damaged, as if the reality editing could extend to manipulating matter itself. In desperation, I began leaving digital breadcrumbs in online forums, encrypted messages hidden in image files, and coded warnings embedded in seemingly innocent comments on social media. But even these were being systematically hunted down and eliminated by algorithms that seemed capable of detecting subversive content, regardless of how cleverly it was disguised. The system's response became increasingly aggressive as my activities escalated. Not only were my own efforts being countered, but anyone who showed interest in my theories began experiencing similar effects. Forum posts asking questions about Y2K anomalies would be deleted by moderators who claimed they violated community guidelines. Users who tried to download my encrypted files would find that their internet connections mysteriously failed during the transfer. Even casual conversations about strange memories from around the year 2000 would be interrupted by distractions or forgotten entirely. I realised that the Observer Protocol was not just targeting me, but was creating a quarantine zone around anyone who came into contact with reality-threatening information. The system was protecting itself by ensuring that dangerous knowledge could not spread beyond the original infected individual. But the most disturbing revelation came when I found my own entry in the deprecated entities database. According to the file, I had been scheduled for removal from the timeline years earlier, but my deletion had been postponed indefinitely due to my classification as a useful aberration. The system was keeping me alive not because it couldn't eliminate me, but because my investigation was serving some purpose in its larger operational framework. I had become a controlled opposition, a safety valve that allowed the system to monitor and contain potential threats to its stability. My research was being permitted to continue because it helped the architects identify weaknesses in their reality editing algorithms. Every method I discovered for detecting anomalies was being studied and countered, making their future interventions more seamless and undetectable. My entire investigation, my years of searching for truth, my desperate attempts to warn others about the nature of our reality, it had all been part of an elaborate debugging process. I was an unwitting beta tester for reality manipulation technology, helping to refine the very system I was trying to expose. The system was closing in, and I was running out of time. But knowing that my elimination was inevitable gave me a strange kind of freedom. If I was going to be deleted from reality, I might as well make my final actions count for something. I began planning one last desperate attempt to break through the system's defences and leave behind evidence that could survive my erasure. The final phase began on December 31st, 2015, exactly 16 years after the original reset. I had been documenting my research obsessively, aware that each day might be my last, when the reality edits suddenly accelerated beyond anything I had experienced before. The system had apparently decided that my usefulness as a debugging tool had been exhausted, and it was time to implement the final stage of the Observer Protocol. I woke up that morning to find that my name had been removed from the lease agreement on my apartment. The landlord, someone I'd been paying rent to for 3 years, looked at me with genuine confusion when I tried to explain the situation. According to his records, the apartment had been vacant for months, and he had no memory of ever meeting me. When I showed him bank statements proving my rent payments, he stared at them as if they were forgeries, unable to reconcile the financial records with his complete lack of memory regarding our landlord-tenant relationship. My bank accounts were frozen, not for any legal reason that the institutions could explain, but because the banks had no record of my existence. My social security number returned no matches in government databases. Credit reporting agencies had no files associated with my identity. Even utility companies claimed that my address had never had service in my name, despite years of bills and payment confirmations that I could produce as evidence. The erasure was happening in real time, with records being modified even as I tried to access them. I would log into an account, confirm that my information was present and correct, then refresh the page to find that all references to my identity had vanished. Customer service representatives would start conversations acknowledging my account, then become confused mid-sentence as the data disappeared from their screens while we were talking. But the most devastating change was with my family. When I went to my mother's house, desperately seeking some anchor to reality, she answered the door as if I were a stranger. Not the careful politeness of someone who had forgotten an acquaintance, but the genuine bewilderment of someone confronted by a complete stranger who claimed intimate knowledge of their life. Her face showed no recognition, no spark of familiarity, no indication that she had ever seen me before in her life. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with concern for my apparent mental state, "but I think you have me confused with someone else. I never had any children." I showed her photographs of us together, pointed to family mementos that I'd given her over the years, recounted shared memories from my childhood with perfect accuracy. But she looked at the photos and saw empty spaces where I should have been, as if the images had been edited to remove my presence while leaving subtle shadows and positioning that proved someone had been there. The gifts I had given her had different origin stories, presents from friends whose names she couldn't quite remember, items she'd bought herself during shopping trips that she recalled with unusual vagueness. When I described specific events from our shared history, family vacations, birthday celebrations, conversations we'd had just weeks earlier, she listened with the patient concern of someone dealing with a delusional stranger. The events I described had happened, but in her memory, they had involved other people or had occurred differently. Family gatherings had taken place without me. Holidays had been celebrated in my absence. Important family milestones had been reached without my participation. The reality editing had reached the point where my existence was being retroactively removed from the timeline. I wasn't just being forgotten. I was being systematically deleted from history itself, with the changes propagating backward through time to create a consistent narrative in which I had never been born. In panic, I tried to contact others who might remember me. Friends from school, former co-workers, even casual acquaintances from online communities. But I found that my phone no longer worked. Not broken or damaged, simply unable to connect to any network, as if my device was no longer authorized to exist on the communication grid. The phone would show full signal strength, but would fail to complete any calls, with error messages claiming that the numbers I was trying to reach did not exist. Internet access became equally problematic. My computer could connect to networks, but websites would fail to load properly, displaying broken layouts and missing content, as if my presence was corrupting the data transfer. Social media platforms would refuse to load my profiles or would display error messages claiming that my accounts had been suspended for terms of service violations that were never specified. I rushed back to my apartment, hoping to salvage what remained of my research, but found that the building's security system no longer recognized my keycards or even my biometric data. The electronic locks that had opened for me thousands of times now acted as if I was a complete stranger, attempting unauthorized entry. The guards didn't throw me out. They simply couldn't see me, their eyes sliding past me as if I were invisible, unable to focus on my presence even when I stood directly in front of them. This was the most disturbing aspect of the erasure process. I wasn't just being removed from records and memories. I was being edited out of other people's perception. I was becoming a ghost, visible only to myself, unable to interact with a world that was forgetting I had ever existed. The few people who could still see me treated me as if I was a hallucination or a figment of their imagination. A homeless man I tried to talk to looked through me as if I wasn't there, then suddenly jerked his head around as if he had heard a voice but couldn't locate its source. A child playing in a park briefly made eye contact with me, then ran to her mother claiming that she had seen the invisible man, only to be told that she was letting her imagination run wild. Even security cameras seemed unable to record my presence. I could see myself in mirrors and reflective surfaces, but surveillance footage would show empty spaces where I should have been, creating the impossible impression that I was a vampire or some other supernatural entity that couldn't be captured on film. In desperation, I broke into an internet cafe, using an old-fashioned computer that might not be connected to the systems that were hunting me. The machine was ancient by 2015 standards, running software that predated many of the modern network protocols that seemed to be blocking my access. I had perhaps minutes before the reality edits caught up with this location, before my presence here was also erased from possibility. My hands shook as I typed what I knew would be my final message, my last chance to warn someone about what was happening. But even as I typed, I could feel my thoughts becoming fuzzy, my memories becoming uncertain. The system wasn't just erasing my existence, it was editing my consciousness itself, making me forget who I had been and what I had discovered. The words on the screen began to blur, not physically but conceptually, as if their meaning was becoming uncertain. I could see the letters, but their significance was slipping away from me like water through my fingers. The knowledge I'd spent 16 years accumulating was being systematically deleted from my mind, leaving only confusion and growing amnesia. I fought to maintain focus, to hold on to the core message long enough to complete it. The world had ended in 1999. Everything since then had been a backup simulation. The system was watching, always watching, and when it detected threats to its stability, it would implement the Observer Protocol. People who remembered too much would be gradually erased, first from records, then from memory, finally from existence itself. But even as I typed these warnings, I could feel them becoming meaningless. The concepts that had driven my investigation for 16 years were dissolving, leaving only the vague impression that something was wrong with the world, something that I could no longer articulate or even fully remember. The screen flickered. My vision became uncertain. I could no longer remember why I was sitting at this computer or what I had been trying to type. The words on the screen looked like random characters, devoid of meaning or context. Somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of fireworks. Or maybe it was just memory, the echo of a celebration from a lifetime ago, when the world had ended and been replaced with something better, safer, more stable. But somewhere in the deepest part of my fading consciousness, I held on to one last thought. If someone reads this, if these words somehow survive the erasure, then maybe the truth can still,